Hello there, and welcome to another AirSim3D C560XL tutorial, and thank you for listening in. Today we'll look at the various outside and inside cockpit and cabin panels and the primary and secondary instruments available in the jet. And as a quick reminder, and it's worth repeating here, please try to view our tutorials in their numbered order, as each one builds on knowledge gained in previous ones, so we do not have to bore you by repeating ourselves all the time. Alright, we have a lot to cover, so let's begin with the outside panels for the C560XL. We'll start here on the port side aft of the wing root, where we find the all-important main battery compartment. It's fully lighted, real-world modeled, animated, all grungy as it should be, labeled and fully functional. It is very critical to the overall electrical systems in this jet, and particularly during cold and dark startups. So be sure to refer to the checklists and those tutorials when using it. Further aft is the main baggage compartment. Again, this one's fully functional and lighted too, and we demonstrate its functionality in the outside tour, so be sure to check that one out. And still further aft is the access panel for the ultra-realistic, fully functional, lighted and fully customized ground power unit, or the GPU. Now all three of these panels are demonstrated in previous tutorials or the outside and inside video tours. As we move around to the starboard side, we see the hydraulic access panel aft of the wing and the fuel panel forward of the wing, which are displayed but are not functional. Similarly, the emergency exit displays and works to a point from the inside, so please view the inside cabin tour for more of those details. Obviously, the main door is 100% authentically modeled, lighted and functional, and is soundproof as it should be for cabin comfort, and we cover its operations in early tours and tutorials. Now turning to the inside, we see that the cockpit has 7 main panels. Now in terms of the cockpit's panel layout, it is modeled after the real-world aircraft we often visited at Boeing Field in Seattle. And so, if you see images on the internet of 560 cockpits that differ from this jet's cockpit layout, it's only because of the fact that XLs are customized a lot by their owners, and we talk about this in detail in our outside tour videos of the cockpit and cabin. So if you need more about why we chose to design the cockpit the way it is and why we chose the instruments you see, please view that tour. Now I'm not going to go into details about how every single instrument works in this tutorial. That will all be covered in our flight tutorials when we show and demonstrate each of them during actual flights. So for now, the C560XL's panel layout is pretty simple. There are no overhead panels in this aircraft because the real one does not have any. Now the front panel face is flat, and that's just like the real one, and that's to save manufacturing costs and keep it simple, as we understand. Its instruments are fairly easy to identify by anyone who has any piloting experience, but let's walk through the normal flight instrument layout and then the emergency battery flight layout too. Yes, you heard me right. This aircraft has 2 separately functioning authentic instrument systems depending on which battery the pilot has chosen to use while operating the aircraft. So now let's run through and identify all the instruments from port to starboard. Oh, by the way, before we begin, if you turn View Show Instrument Descriptions on in the sim, then mouse over anything in the cockpit and you will see a description for that instrument. Try that when you are first starting out until you become familiar with the cockpit and its layout. Okay, so first we see the pilot side fuse panel, and under these 2 red covers are the individual battery disconnect and interior master switches. Generally these 2 switches are left on at all times, but they are fully operational. Now don't confuse this master switch with connecting the battery during a cold and dark startup. We have cold and dark tutorials for you to learn how to connect and disconnect the main battery that's outside that we just looked at earlier. In fact, this main battery switch gives the pilot the option to isolate the main battery from the cockpit in an emergency only. Similarly, the interior master switch isolates the cabin electricals during an emergency, so everything goes dark if this switch is turned off. This emergency locator transmitter Again, this is another emergency operation, so just leave it off during normal flight. Now above them are the pilot side panel dimmer and map light dials. The vent and flow dials animate, but they don't really do any work per se. To its right is the main section on the panel for the pilot. Running through those instruments now, top to bottom, there are fully functional caution and master warning annunciators, and they are tied into all the systems of the aircraft. So, if they wink at you, pay close attention to them. The Pilot Operating Handbook, or the POH, is available on demand online on our website and provides detailed information on their meaning and operations. Generally, what you do to use the POH is use the labels in the aircraft to be able to find topics in that POH. We don't expect you to read everything. Moving on into their left, we see a small custom throttle indent visual reference instrument. We saw this actually in our reference jet at Boeing Field. This is not made up. And it's a very neat way to know where the throttles are positioned without having to look down at the throttle stack all the time. By the way, if you see this going red, throttle back. You should not be putting the engine into red. More of that in a minute when you talk about engine instruments. To its left, the aircraft's call sign. Now each time you change a livery, this will update to match the livery's registration number automatically. And here we have the all-important angle of attack dial. With the real and augmented switch on augmented, you will see a digital readout also. The jet comes with two 4-function independently operating digital clocks, one for each side on the pilot side and one for the co-pilot side. They display GMT, local time, a flight timer, which is activated each time there is no weight on wheels, and a stopwatch. Now below that, if you are in the augmented panel mode layout, you will see this augmented version of the EFIS control panel that includes an auto throttle speed setting selection. By the way, and to be clear, the real jet does not have an auto throttle, but we provided it as an augmented convenience for the simulator experience. Everything here works and has a purpose in the aircraft systems. Now, if we flip this switch to realistic mode, the panel then changes to a 100% authentic model, and you lose the auto throttle again, because that's not what the real jet has. Tutorial 1.5 discusses the realistic and augmented panels in much greater detail. Now below that we find the DME, the distance measuring equipment, which displays station identification and auto-tunes to the VOR being used to display distance to, closure, and time readouts. You can also track ADF distances and change from miles to kilometers on demand. To the extreme left is the electrical panel. Again, every switch and dial here functions and is very important to the normal operation of the aircraft. Below the DME is the COM panel, again, fully functional to the extent that they can be in the sim, and below it is the cockpit panel lighting panel. Just under the panel is the parking brake on the left, the rudder or gust lock, the emergency brake, and the gear blowdown set of levers, and all of these are fully modeled and 100% functional. One of the most important switches of our cockpit experience is this little day-night switch, which is used to brighten and darken instruments during the day or dim them at night. Now that's pretty cool, and you will not find dark cockpit instruments during the day even if the sun is shining directly into the cockpit. We discuss what all these electrical switches and dimmers do as they change different positions and sections of the cockpit panel lighting in later electrical systems focused tutorials, but for now feel free to experiment with them to see what they do. The large and very visible pilot primary flight display is placed in the center of the pilot's line of vision. Great care was taken to make the artificial horizon portion of this instrument look nice and 3D. It has a bit of depth, and this level of detail is seldom seen in other models we looked at. Notice also that the altitude tape's design is also an exact replica of the real C560XL, and yes, in case you were wondering, the fonts and colors are all an exact match, a color swatch match of our real jet template too. The top strip of this PDF is the region for the autopilot enunciations, and the POH discusses all of that in detail, and also we will have an autopilot flight focus tutorials where all of this functionality is discussed in detail. But for now, white enunciations are for functions that have not been captured by the autopilot, and then those turn green once or when the function is captured, and then the autopilot will actively fly that function. So as a quick example, if we are intercepting a VOR course, VOR will be white until the AP captures the heading. Then VOR will turn green and begins to turn into the needle to tell you that the AP is actively flying that course. Okay, moving along, at the bottom of the PFD's casing, don't miss the little FPV or flight path vector button. This feature shows the predicted flight path in the PFD's horizon view and is usually found in fighter jets, but we thought, what the heck, why not here too? To its right is the decision height light and the slip and turn indicator with its glass covering, and the barometer select switch, and finally on the right is the barometer adjust dial. Now turning to the center panel and starting at the top and working our way all the way down through the two seats. First, we see at the top, next to the down tube and the glare shield cluster, this little box for the pilot side only, which is the angle of attack indexer. It turns on and off automatically, there's no switch for this, as required during certain phases of the flight. And its visual cues will change based on whether the cockpit is in the real or augmented modes. There's more on this in the online POH. Search for the term AOA indexer. And there's a lighted wet compass positioned to its right. Now if you look further down on the glare shield and positioned at the base of the down tube, way back in the front next to the windshield, you'll see two little pipes pointing upwards or forwards. These kind of look like tubes, but they are actually housings for red anti-ice warning lights. They light up at night when the aircraft has already started to ice up. Now in augmented mode the lights turn on but are hard to see during the day, so pilots will see the wing anti-ice annunciator blink if the anti-ice systems are off and there is ice accumulating on the aircraft. Frankly, if you see this, you are already behind the curve and in danger of crashing. So plan ahead for icing by turning the anti-ice systems on, because they are not instant. The jet anti-icing systems are 100% modeled to take into account ambient temperatures, so they may take up to 8 minutes to heat up, depending on what the outside temperatures are and the other conditions in the simulator. In icing, you will find that in the day the windshield will gradually fog up, but at night, since you can't see the fogging, you will see the red glow from those anti-ice warning lights. Anyway, the rest of the glare shield with their speakers, exact screw placements and high-res PBR materials and grunge and dust, they are all there to provide deep immersive and functional authenticity. Pretty nice, eh? Our second big piece of the instrument panel layout is right up at the top, and dead center is the 100% authentic 42 windowed, fully functional and lighted main annunciator panel, and this has over 90 possible flight and system status and annunciations. Each window displays right or left information independently, or like this one, they can be dual purpose with different lighting colors which may be steady or even blinking. By the way, the online POH also displays images of and lists each one of these annunciators and what they mean through all flight phases. So search for the term annunciator panel details in the POH to learn more. Now a dark panel means everything is functioning normally. That's what you want to see. No annunciations. And there's a lot to learn here, so take your time and be sure to view our tutorial 1.6 for a deep dive into its functionality. To the right and left of that panel are the reverser and engine, fire warning, extinguisher warning, buttons and annunciators. And these are one for each side of the engine. They are authentically modeled, timed and lighted for each side to operate independently. Here too, if you have not already seen our first outside tutorial, you are missing something exciting as a real-time engine failure event. So be sure to check that out to see how the jet manages engine failures very realistically. Third, and moving below the annunciator panel, this is the main upfront center panel where we see from the left the main radio unit with its squawk and mode C transmitting options. Below that, and if in augmented mode, this is the autopilot power panel with the really important turn dial. These instruments below are the standby, horizon and VOR instruments. Now moving back to the top, here are the two glass engine instruments, and to its right is the N1 target setting dial. Very quickly, pilots need to set this N1 bug for the N1 RPM display to have a visual reminder reference to not over-rev the engines. And as we specifically called out in tutorial 1, remember this jet is not an airliner, so don't fly it like one by slamming the throttles to 100%. That is not how real pilots fly this aircraft. Please take a look at the instruments also. Notice also that it does not have 0 to 110 as a linear scale. That's the real world design of it. So if you set the bug at 90% and pull your view back, you will think that you're flying halfway up the gauge at 50 N1, but that's not true. You're actually flying at 90% N1. And this is the way the jet instrument is designed in real life. And a note about this engine instrument cluster. When you fly this jet at altitude and everything's normal, you'll notice what pilots call the straight line. Cessna intentionally designed these displays so that the position of the slider pointers for each gauge will generally be seen positioned in the middle of their instruments. That's what pilots refer to as normal straight line operations. Isn't that a great design idea? But how do you get things to operate normally? Well, our advice is to fly the aircraft gently. Gentle throttle movements, slow autopilot speed changes, easy when you rotate, low G-forces at altitude. Even the reverser operations, don't turn them on and then slam the throttles to max on touchdown. Remember, you are not a big 300-ton plus airliner with a huge amount of inertia that you need to stop before you run out of runway. Instead, you are a light, very powerful small business jet. Sometimes on landings we just pop the reversers open with no thrust at all, and their drag acts like a sail to gently slow the aircraft down anyway. So go easy on the aircraft and its systems. And also, don't subject your passengers to more than 4 or 5 knot accelerations per second. Well, you wanted authenticity. Well, then fly the aircraft realistically. Your passengers will thank you, and your engine instruments will be all straight line normal. Alright, so moving along, just below the engine instruments is the autopilot function strip, and some other indicators and annunciators and the standby radio and a custom G1000. Now a quick word about autopilots. As we see, the jet has its own 100% authentic autopilot, and by virtue of having a G1002, the G1000 provides an autopilot function also. So, which autopilot should you use? Now, for all the reasons we discussed in great detail in our earlier internal cockpit and cabin tour videos, we strongly recommend using the jet's own authentic 100% functional autopilot panel and buttons and not the G1000's AP. Now, it's not that the G1000's AP does not function. It does. But if you want to fly this aircraft like real C560XL pilots and use AP functions in a more realistic way, then use the jet's custom AP, not the G1000's standard AP. To the left of the G1000 is the MFD. It provides 6 submodes plus weather and terrain radar displays. And this is the instrument to go to access and display the checklists. Now we have separate checklist tutorials numbered 1.1 and 1.2, so be sure to watch those, please. And now would be a good time to talk about and mention that pilots can pop out the PFD, the MFD, and the G1000. Clicking the top half of this instrument displays its HSI, and clicking its lower half displays its MFD, and those are both fully functional. Moving on down to subpanel 4, This panel houses the gear lever and its anti-skid switch. This is where we find icing, nav and cabin placard lighting, bleed air source, and air conditioning and pressurization panels. And continuing further down to subpanel 5 is where we find the throttle stack with the flaps levers on the right and the 100% modeled and functional trim lever on the left. Here's a quick tip, by the way. To center the trim wheel quickly, click the area to the top of the wheel where the cursor changes to a hand. Similarly, to center or move both throttle handles in sync, tap and grab the space in the middle between the throttle paddles. The left side throttle handle provides a toggle button, and this is a quick way to get both engines to max power quickly. But hold on. Remember our earlier warnings about slamming the throttles full gas? Holds true over here too. So use this function for emergencies only, and only for under a minute, or your engines will suffer. Just below is the guarded speed brake switch. By the way, this is not a spoiler. This aircraft does not have a spoiler, so it doesn't really interfere with the wing's lift as much as an airliner spoiler does. And those are real holes, that's not like painted on. So take a minute to look at the actual speed brake modeling outside too. A lot of care was taken to model this. So moving down further aft is subpanel 6 with its fully functional master caution and warning integrated 10 station pre-flight rotary test that pilots will use as a pre-flight checklist to ensure that all the systems are good to go before the flight begins. Wow, that was a mouthful. Notice the timing and sequencing of enunciations as you click through the stations. Those are all 100% authentically modeled and lighted and timed. And those are all actual sound recordings from the real jet too. To its right are the taxi and landing light switches and the custom pulse landing lights. These pulse lights are 100% authentically modeled, and their behavior takes into account various factors like air traffic collision awareness, the aircraft's configuration, the custom flight profiles, and then it all automatically decides when to pulse or run steady. That's pretty cool. And last but not least, panel number 7, the console between the seats. Everything here works, and as we said earlier, how all of this functions will come later in flight-related tutorials, so you can see their cause and effect. But in summary, the instruments on the pilot side and co-pilot sides are linked to the instruments on their side of the cockpit panels for individual control. For example, if you elect to click this button on the co-pilot's panel, then wind speed and direction will play only on the co-pilot's side PFD. However, there are, as one would expect, single controllers for the MFD, the autopilot, and the trims. And this is in keeping with the 100% realism and authenticity of the real aircraft. Okay, so that's the central stack completed, and so now moving on to the co-pilot side of the front panel, we see some of the same instruments we found at the pilot side, so we won't repeat those over here, but there are differences, and most notably for the auxiliary power unit, or the APU, here on the co-pilot's side panel. The APU has its own startup procedure, so pilots will look to the checklists for that. But most importantly, on the co-pilot side, we see the APU amp meter, which activates when the APU gen is brought online, which charges the main battery. We'll do a separate in-depth tutorial on APU use, but a couple of highlights worth mentioning here about this 100% authentically modeled, lighted, and failure-prone and functional unit. First, as a matter of principle, this jet does not require you to start the APU to start engines like you may be used to doing in other aircraft. So this is another reason to say again, set aside your assumptions about how this aircraft works. There is a real reason for its design to not need the APU on all the time. For small aircraft, this is an added additional cost. So unlearn that habit you might have acquired from your airline experience. Second, you will, however, need to run the APU to start the aircraft only if your amps are below 23. I think that's 23. Well, anyway, check the POH for accuracy, please. But if you do not have the APU running and you're attempting to start on battery, And if you ever find the starter spinning the engines away madly without the engines actually firing when the throttle introduces fuel, it's probably because there is not enough amperage to spin the starter fast enough. In that case, run the APU and use its bleed source to get the engines turning. Third, once you have the APU running, do not forget to turn the APU generators on. It's happened to us experts too. We run the APU, we forgot to turn the generators on, the avionics are running, and flat battery as a result. Yes. So an important little piece over here, this APU gen on annunciator lights to alert you to turn the generator on, not that it is on. Remember, annunciators in this jet turn on only when they need your attention. So if you turn the APU gen on, then the lighted annunciator will turn off, signifying all is well. So watch that. And if you follow the checklist anyway, you can't go wrong. Finally, the APU draws fuel from the starboard wing tank, the right wing tank. So running it for a period of time will cause a weight imbalance in the aircraft. To balance that out, only once you have engines running, then use this cross-feed switch to balance out the aircraft's weight. This is often done during the taxi out phase, but even then a few pounds here or there is no real cause for concern. Alright, so what are the other unique instruments on the co-pilot side? There are the APU fire and engagement and failure warnings. These will light up if there is an APU fire and will shut the APU down automatically. You also have the main battery temperature gauge. Actually, this one considers ambient temperatures, battery load, and charging rates to read the temperature into the battery box. So what if you see it going red? Well, that signifies a very high charging rate, not temperature. It's the charging rate that causes the temperature. So turn off one of the engine generators to lower the charging rate. The strip of buttons and switches at the bottom of that panel animate and light up, but serve no real system function. This oxygen gauge, however, does work, and O2 needs to be topped up when required by using the SIM's crew oxygen slider found in the weights and SIM's balance menu. And speaking of that menu, feel free to load up the aircraft with the weights of your passengers in each seat, and this will affect aircraft performance and flight range. One final thing on the panel. There are reference points that you can use to help keep the nose wheel centered on runway, taxi, or ramp markings. Yep, this aircraft uses some guides on that panel to help you do this. So, a couple of learnings here for you. When seated, you will know that your head is correctly centered and placed in the cockpit when this little white ball is lined up directly in front of the orange one behind it. Those are known as the sight balls. That's to get the pilot in the center of the pilot seat. But how do we get the aircraft centered on the runway or taxi markings outside also? How do we ensure that the jet itself is centered out there? Well, we designed something special for this scenario too. So when you're in the cockpit, seated in the center position, look for the cockpit mic. That's this little object with the blue circle, and the panel screw to the immediate right of it. Now, using them as markers, if you position the runway or taxi markings to align with those objects, between those objects, then the nose wheel will be centered on whatever line you are trying to follow. But that's of course when you're traveling in a straight line. Going around a bend obviously needs the outside taxi line to drift left or right as needed, but in a straight line, that's how it's done. But honestly, don't get too obsessive about getting this perfect, okay? Well, alright, you do you, but just saying, make sure that the outside marking you are trying to track is positioned somewhere between the right edge of the mic and the leftmost screw on the front panel, and you should be fine. But we spent some time on the design to get this right, to make it easier to steer the jet to where the pilot needs it to be steered and centered. We don't find this much in many models, but I'm glad we did it for our aircraft. Now, time for a quick mention about the yoke, but particularly about one of its special functions. We put a lot of work into making the C560XL's yoke look and feel very realistic, and its buttons all work. Notice first the scratches and scuffs on the yoke. Its column where the mic has rubbed through the paint. The scratched levers under the pilot's front panel, but also those rudder pedals. Everything here is individually customized with grunge and scratches for added realism, and they are not mirror images or copies of each other. Also take time to look at the glass-covered Cessna Mustang emblem in the center of both yokes. Notice the great three-dimensional foil effect that replicates the real thing. Next, and we are particularly proud of the yoke's functional buttons, it's the APTCS button, or the touch control steering, that's used when the autopilot is engaged. You don't often see this complex function working in many other aircraft models. Now, to operate it, you need to click and hold this button. You must keep it held in and on while the autopilot is engaged, and doing this will give you temporary and manual control of the aircraft. Well, this means that you will be able to change heading or altitude while the AP is still engaged, so you don't lose the AP functions that have already been set. As you can see, I'm flying off course while I have the button held. And this is an especially cool and useful feature to use to comply with short-term changes that are commanded by ATC, or to quickly avoid TCAS conflicts without first reaching to disengage the AP and lose all its settings to get control of the jet. But the moment it is released, the AP takes back control and works automatically to get the jet back onto course. Neat, huh? You don't often get this level of detail and functionality in many other aircraft. Okay, so what else? Let's look at the cabin now. Look around and discover. You will find many authentically worded, accurately labeled, colored, lighted, and placed signs, placards, warnings, and panels all over this aircraft. Everything kind of moves. You can move the lights, you can move the chairs, you can open the tables. Play around and explore during long flights when on autopilot. But also pay close attention to the door and exit annunciations and the cabin and exit master lighting panel. This panel displays authentic and functional door lock annunciations and has button switches that control preset entry and cabin lighting. And recalling our earlier in-depth conversation in our previous cockpit and cabin tours, and just as a reminder, the lighting you see in this jet, especially in the cabin and the cockpit, everywhere actually, outside and inside, comes from the use of only real 3D bulbs. There are actually over 300 of them, all individually tuned, directed, and custom colored for that extra level of attention to detail. This jet has no, repeat, no fake Photoshop artwork to simulate lighting. So there are no fake 2D lit texture paintings in this aircraft. It's all real 3D light beams. So now pilots have no more excuse to avoid flying at night now. The C560XL takes cockpit and cabin lighting to a whole new level, and we encourage you to experience it and to see it and believe it. So there you have it. Panels and placards and instruments and runway centering and real 3D lighting for spectacular night flying. All 100% authentic and modeled and available for you to use and enjoy while flying the C560XL. And that's all we have for today, and until the next time, see ya!